A little girl gave a sandwich to a homeless man who looked starving. The next day, she woke up to a helicopter hovering over her humble home. The first ray of sunlight barely slipped through the cracks of the old blinds as Emily got up from her creaky wooden bed. The small room she shared with her mother was cold and damp. The walls showed signs of wear, with peeling paint and damp stains in the corners. But Emily never complained. Her eyes shone with a brightness that contrasted sharply with the sad atmosphere of the house, and her mind was ready for another day at school, though it was never a truly welcoming place for her. Trying not to make any noise, she slid out of bed and tiptoed towards the small kitchen corner. Her worn-out fabric shoes did little to muffle her steps, yet she moved with the grace of a feather, avoiding waking her mother, Rachel. She glanced at her sleeping on the makeshift sofa bed they had set up after Grandpa got sick and took over the only remaining bed. Her mother looked exhausted, her brow furrowed even in her dreams, as if worries followed her relentlessly, even in sleep. Rachel had worked late last night, as she did almost every night at the corner tailor shop. Orders were scarce, and payments even scarcer. But every stitch, every thread she wove, was a way to fight against the poverty that had fallen over the family since Emily's father passed away. Watching her, Emily felt a lump in her throat. Her mother seemed to have aged prematurely, and the dark circles under her eyes were silent witnesses of sleepless nights, sacrifices, and countless worries. "I promise one day things will be different, Mom," Emily thought, with a determination far beyond her young age. Then, quietly, she moved to the back room, where Henry, her grandfather, lay resting with the help of an oxygen tank. The constant hum of the generator filled the small space, mingling with the smell of medicine and mold. Grandpa's room had once been full of life and joy. Now the walls were covered in yellowed photographs of happier days. Her grandpa, young and proud in his miner's uniform, her father holding her as a baby, teaching her to ride a bike, and her mother, radiant and beautiful, long before the hardships dimmed the light in her eyes. Emily stepped closer to the bed with soft steps. She watched his wrinkled face, marked by pain and fatigue. He breathed heavily, every breath sounding strained, as if even that simple act was a burden. She leaned down to kiss his forehead gently, taking care not to bump the thin oxygen tube that ran from his nose. "Good morning, Grandpa," she whispered softly, though she knew he wouldn't hear her. His sleep was always restless, and he often woke before dawn just to check on her and ask if everything was all right. She left the room with a heavy heart. She knew every day was a struggle for her mother to keep Henry equipped with what he needed to survive. Medicines were expensive, and the oxygen generator often threatened to break down at the worst times. But Emily also knew that as much as her grandpa fought, it wouldn't be forever. And that thought haunted her in the silence of the night, when exhaustion and fear caught up with her. "Be strong, Emily. Today will be a good day," she told herself as she hurriedly packed her small backpack. It only held a couple of books inherited from her older cousins and a notebook with some recycled pages, but the most precious item that morning was the small sandwich her mother had carefully prepared the night before. The bread was a bit dry and the cheese barely visible between the slices, but Emily looked at it with affection, knowing the sacrifice it represented. Rachel often skipped meals so Emily could take something to school, and that hurt more than any material lack. But she never dared to say anything. With the sandwich carefully wrapped in a napkin, she quietly said goodbye to her mother and grandfather and left the house. The crisp morning air enveloped her immediately. The street was still empty, with only a few sounds breaking the silence. The creak of an old bicycle, the murmur of a distant conversation, and a rooster's crow announcing the new day. Emily walked lightly, crossing the neighborhood alleys and giving a slight nod to the few neighbors watching her from their doorsteps, their faces hardened by distrust and despair. The path to school passed through the Central Park, a place that had seen better days. The swings were rusty, and the benches broken and covered in graffiti, But there were always people around. Mothers gathered to complain about their problems while watching small children running around. Young, unemployed men huddled in corners, trading cigarettes and shattered dreams. And for several days, a new visitor had settled in the park, a homeless man who spent his nights curled up under a large tree covered by a ragged blanket. Emily had noticed his presence, but always kept her distance. He wasn't the typical loud, aggressive vagabond that sometimes scared passers-by. This man seemed to be in another world, lost in thoughts no one else could understand. Today, however, something about him made her stop. The man was hunched over, head resting on his knees, body shivering from the cold, despite the blanket covering him. His clothes were in tatters and dirt covered much of his face, but it was the look of exhaustion and despair in his eyes that caught Emily's attention. Something stirred inside her. Why didn't anyone do anything? Why did everyone pass by, pretending not to see him? Her stomach growled at that moment, reminding her of the sandwich in her backpack. Her first instinct was to walk away, to ignore the man like everyone else. After all, that was her breakfast, the only food she would have until lunch. But then she remembered her mother and the nights she went without dinner so Emily could eat. If her mother could make those sacrifices, why couldn't she? Before she could change her mind, she took the sandwich out of her backpack and approached him with trembling steps. The man slowly lifted his head, as if every movement took immense effort. Seeing the little girl standing in front of him, holding out the sandwich with her tiny hands, his eyes widened in surprise, and an indescribable emotion crossed his face. With trembling hands, he accepted the sandwich, whispering a weak "thank you," so faint Emily could barely hear it. "Thank you," said the man, his eyes glistening. Emily smiled timidly at him, and without saying another word, turned around and walked away, feeling her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know who that man was, nor what had brought him to end up in the park, but at that moment, she knew she had done the right thing. In the distance, the man watched as the small figure of Emily walked away, his hand still trembling as he held the sandwich, which meant much more than just a simple breakfast. For him, it had been a gesture that restored something he thought was lost forever, his faith in the goodness of people. The next morning arrived with a clear sky and a bright sun, but inside Emily, everything felt a little grayer. She had spent the entire night thinking about the man in the park, remembering the look on his face when she handed him the sandwich. It hadn't been a simple expression of gratitude. It was as if that small gesture had meant something far more profound, as if the dry bread and the slice of cheese had been an offering of hope in a sea of darkness. She wondered if the man was okay, if he had found another place to sleep, or if he was still under the same tree, wrapped in his tattered blanket. That morning, as she got ready to leave, she noticed her mother watching her with a strange, worried look. Rachel, who always woke up exhausted but with a forced smile, now looked at her with an intensity that made Emily shift uncomfortably. She pressed her lips together as if she were about to say something, but finally just sighed. "Emily, did you eat well at school yesterday?" she asked suddenly. The little girl's heart skipped a beat. She knew her mother would notice something odd, but she wasn't prepared to talk about the sandwich. "Yes, Mum. Everything was fine," she answered softly, looking down at the floor. Rachel leaned closer to look at her face. Although Emily tried to hide it, her mother knew her too well. However, she didn't insist. Instead, she took her daughter's small backpack and before giving it back, slipped a small apple inside that she had saved for her. "Take this with you today, all right?" she said, caressing her cheek with a gesture full of tenderness. Emily felt a lump in her throat. She knew how much that apple had cost. She knew that Rachel would probably not eat anything else for the rest of the day to make up for that expense. But she nodded, unable to tell her the truth. She didn't want her mother to worry. She didn't want her to find out that her breakfast from the day before had ended up in the hands of a stranger. With the apple safely tucked in her backpack, she left the house and began her usual route to school. But as she reached the park, her heart began to pound harder. She glanced at the big tree where she had last seen the man and felt a mix of relief and sadness to see he was still there. He was sitting in the same position, his head resting on his knees and the blanket wrapped around his shoulders. He looked even smaller, more fragile, as if the wind could carry away what little was left of him at any moment. Emily stood still, fighting against the urge to go closer. She knew she couldn't give him anything else. She didn't have any more sandwiches or food to offer. The apple in her backpack felt heavier than a brick, and doubt began to gnaw at her. She could give him the apple, yes, but then what would she eat? Her mother had already sacrificed too much to make sure she could carry that piece of fruit to school. But when she saw the man slowly lift his head, his empty eyes meeting hers, the rest of the world faded away. Her own needs and her mother's words about the importance of taking care of her health no longer mattered. The only thing she saw was the desperation in the gaze of that stranger, a desperation that made her feel as if her own heart was shattering into 1,000 pieces. She took the apple out of her backpack with trembling fingers. Without thinking further, she walked towards him and held it out, feeling her palms sweat from nerves. The man blinked, surprised, staring at the bright red fruit as if it were something unreal. Slowly, he looked up at Emily, his eyes filled with gratitude and confusion. "Why," he stammered, his voice broken and weak. Emily didn't know what to say. She only knew that she had to do something, no matter how small. Because I thought you might be hungry," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The man took the apple with trembling hands, as if afraid it might disappear if he touched it too firmly. Tears rolled down his dirty face, and without saying another word, he brought the fruit to his lips, taking a bite with a look of pure wonder. Emily stood there, unsure of what to do, watching as he savored each bite as if it were the finest meal he had ever tasted. "Thank you," he repeated between bites, his voice broken by emotion. "Thank you, little one. I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," she replied, shaking her head gently. "I just wanted to help." And truly, she expected nothing in return. She didn't think about rewards or gratitude. She just wanted that man to feel, if only for a moment, that he wasn't completely alone in the world. When the school bell rang in the distance, she knew she had to go. She waved goodbye with a small smile and ran off, leaving the man under the tree with the half-eaten apple and eyes full of tears. Throughout the morning, as the monotonous voices of teachers filled the classroom, Emily couldn't concentrate. She wondered if he was okay, if she would see him again when she left. Her stomach growled with hunger, reminding her of the sacrifice she had made. But she tried to ignore it. Thinking about how much that apple had meant to him gave her strength. When school let out, she ran back to the park, eager to see if the man was still there. But the corner under the tree was empty. The tattered blanket, the cardboard he used to sit on, everything was gone. Emily stopped, breathing heavily, looking around for any sign of him. Had he found another place? Had someone else helped him? She felt a strange emptiness in her chest, as if something had broken inside her by not seeing him there. However, she decided not to dwell on it. She had done what she could. That's what her mother always told her. "Do what you can, Emily, even if no one asks you to." And she had done it. That night when she got home, Rachel was waiting in the small living room. Her mother looked at her with the same worried expression she had seen that morning, but didn't say anything. Emily curled up beside her, resting her head on her lap. "Are you okay, sweetie?" Rachel whispered, gently stroking her hair. Emily nodded. "Yes, Mum. I just thought about what you always say, about doing good, even when no one's watching." Rachel observed her in silence, as if trying to understand her daughter's words. Finally, she sighed and hugged her tightly. "That's true, Emily. But remember to also take care of yourself. The world needs good people, but it also needs strong ones." The words echoed in Emily's mind as she snuggled closer to her mother. That night, she fell asleep with the image of the man from the park etched in her memory, hoping, deep down in her heart, that he was okay. The next morning, everything changed. Shouts and excited voices jolted her awake. She rushed out of her room, heart pounding hard, and when she reached the window, she stood there, breathless. There, in the park in front of her house, a helicopter gleamed under the morning light, surrounded by men in suits and black vehicles. The crowd gathered around, and murmurs turned into gasps of amazement. Among them stood a middle-aged man, impeccably dressed, looking directly at Emily's small house with a calm smile full of gratitude. She didn't know who he was, but something in his eyes seemed familiar. "Mom, what's happening?" she whispered, clutching Rachel's hand. Then, among the crowd, the man stepped forward. His gaze met Emily's, and in that moment, she understood everything. It was him, the man from the park. But he wasn't the same. Emily couldn't tear her eyes away from the elegantly dressed man now staring at her from the center of the crowd. How could it be? How could a homeless man, who barely had the strength to move, transform into such an imposing figure? The little girl felt her heart racing wildly as the whispers around her grew louder and louder. The neighbors gathered at their doorways, their faces reflecting a mixture of confusion, surprise, and curiosity. Most of them had been woken up by the noise of the helicopter, and now, like a swarm of bees, they buzzed around the luxury cars that had just arrived. Questions flew through the air. Who was this man? Why had a helicopter landed in their humble neighborhood? What interest did he have in the Parker family's house? Rachel watched from the window with the same disbelief as her daughter. Without saying a word, she stepped away from the glass and walked toward the front door. Her mind raced, searching for an explanation. Richard Collins, the man who looked at her with a calm smile, was the same beggar her daughter had mentioned just the night before, when Emily had curled up beside her and told her about her small act of kindness. The story seemed unbelievable, and yet there he was, immaculate, surrounded by assistants and guards. "Mom, don't go out!" Emily exclaimed, gripping Rachel's hand. "What's happening?" Rachel looked at her, her face pale, lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know how to protect her from something she herself didn't understand. "Stay behind me, Emily," she whispered finally. "I don't know who he is, but he doesn't seem to want to harm us." The little girl nodded, eyes wide, and followed her mother to the door. Rachel opened it slowly, as if fearing that a sudden movement might shatter the fragile calm in the air. As they stepped outside, the murmurs of the crowd grew louder. The neighbors whispered, pointing fingers, while some stepped back, afraid to get too close. It was as if an invisible force was holding them back. Richard Collins moved forward, his polished leather shoes crunching the dry dirt of the neighborhood. Each step was firm and steady, a complete contrast to the broken, desperate figure Emily had known under the tree. The girl felt the ground shift beneath her feet, unable to reconcile the image of the starving man with that of the millionaire now only a few meters away. "Good morning," Richard said, his deep, melodious voice resonating in the expectant silence of the neighborhood. "I apologize for the commotion. It was never my intention to cause such a scene." Rachel's eyes narrowed. Although he looked entirely different, there was something in his gaze that seemed vaguely familiar. Realizing that all attention was focused on them, she squared her shoulders, instinctively shielding her daughter behind her. "Who are you?" she asked firmly. "And why are you here?" Richard smiled softly, bowing his head in a gesture of respect. "My name is Richard Collins, and I'm here because of your daughter." The words dropped like a bomb on the crowd. The murmurs turned into a chaotic buzz, and the neighbors pushed forward, trying to listen more closely. Because of Emily? What would a millionaire want with a child? "This makes no sense," they whispered all around. Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. She tightened her grip on Emily's hand. "Because of Emily?" she repeated slowly, feeling her mouth go dry. "What do you mean?" Richard took a deep breath, as if searching for the right words. "Yesterday, this little girl did something that many adults have forgotten how to do. She showed compassion and generosity without expecting anything in return." The crowd fell silent as he spoke. "She offered me her only sandwich without knowing me, without knowing who I was, just because she thought I was hungry. In a world where people pass by without even looking at others." She stopped. "She saw me as a human being." Rachel's eyes widened in surprise. She looked at Emily, who blushed under the intense gaze of everyone around her. All of this was because of a sandwich. "But you're not just a homeless man," Rachel finally said, trying to piece it all together. "Why would you do this?" Richard looked down for a moment, as if debating how to explain. Finally, he lifted his gaze and continued. "No, I am not a homeless man. I'm Richard Collins, president of the Collins Foundation and CEO of Collins Enterprises. But who I am now doesn't matter. What matters is that I was in a dark place in my life. My wife and son distanced themselves from me years ago. I lost my way, and I decided to search for something money can't buy: humanity. I dressed as a homeless man, wandered the streets, hoping to find someone who would show me that kindness still exists, someone to remind me what it means to be human." He paused and looked at Emily, who still didn't fully understand what was happening. "And I found that in her. In her simple act of giving me her food without expecting anything in return, she gave me back something I thought I had lost forever: hope." The murmurs resumed, but this time they were filled with a mix of admiration and disbelief. Some neighbors pushed and jostled to get closer, while others stood back, frowning, unable to accept that all this was happening in their humble neighborhood. "That's why I'm here," Richard continued, his voice strong and clear. "To thank her in the only way I know how, by changing Emily's and her family's lives. I want to make sure they never have to go hungry again or worry about how to pay for her grandfather's medicine. I want to provide all the support needed so they can live a decent life." The silence that followed was overwhelming. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for Rachel's response. "Change our lives?" she repeated, her voice breaking, eyes brimming with tears. "But we can't accept something like this. We didn't do it to get anything." Richard smiled softly and nodded. "I know, and that's what makes it even more special. But please, let me help. Let me give back what Emily's kindness gave me." Before Rachel could respond, a sudden movement in the crowd caught everyone's attention. Natalia Thompson, the nosiest and most envious neighbor, pushed her way through with a look of fake astonishment and an overly sweet smile. "Rachel, what a blessing!" she exclaimed with exaggerated enthusiasm. "My goodness, I always knew you and Emily were special." She glanced at Richard with bright eyes. "Mr. Collins, I'm a friend of the family, if you ever need anything." But Richard barely looked at her. His focus remained on Rachel and Emily, as if no one else existed at that moment. "I don't want you to think this is charity," he said, ignoring Natalia. "I just want to give you the opportunity you deserve." The entire neighborhood held its breath, waiting. The offer was as tempting as it was impossible to accept. Rachel looked at Emily, searching for a sign, an answer she didn't know how to find. Finally, she swallowed and raised her chin firmly. "I need time to think about it," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I can't accept something like this right away. But thank you, truly thank you." Richard nodded, with an understanding that seemed almost paternal. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." As he walked away, followed by his entourage, the neighborhood erupted in whispers and questions. Some neighbors approached Rachel, congratulating her with insincere compliments, while others looked at her with a mix of suspicion and resentment. but Rachel didn't hear them. Her eyes were only for Emily, who stood beside her with her head down and trembling hands. "Mum, what are we going to do?" Emily asked in a tiny voice. Rachel didn't know what to say. The only thing she knew was that somehow their lives had just changed forever. The sun had started to dip, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink when Richard Collins returned to the Parker neighborhood the following day. This time, there were no helicopters or bodyguards, just a discreet black car and him, dressed simply but elegantly, as if trying to blend into the surroundings without drawing attention. However, it was impossible for him to go unnoticed. The neighbors watched him closely, whispering to each other every time they saw him walking through the dusty streets towards Emily's house. News of his offer to the family had spread like wildfire through the neighborhood, and everyone eagerly awaited to see what Rachel would decide. When Richard arrived at the small house, Rachel was already waiting at the door, her posture tense and her lips pressed into a thin line. Her dark circles were more pronounced than usual, and her hands trembled almost imperceptibly. As he approached, her expression hardened, as if preparing for a battle. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Rachel," Richard greeted kindly, bowing his head slightly. "Good afternoon, Mr. Collins," she responded in a neutral tone, without inviting him in. Emily peeked timidly from behind the door, watching Richard with a mix of curiosity and nervousness. The businessman gave her a soft smile, which made her take a step back, but she didn't look away. "May we speak?" he asked. "I won't take up much of your time." Rachel hesitated for a moment, but finally nodded and motioned for him to come inside. The interior of the house was as modest as Richard had imagined the first time he saw it. The paint on the walls was peeling, and the furniture, although clean and tidy, was old and worn. But there was something warm in the atmosphere, something he hadn't felt in years, an air of dignity and love that couldn't be bought with money. They sat around the small dining table while Emily remained standing beside her mother, watching with wide, expectant eyes. Henry, the grandfather, peeked from the doorway of his room, coughing lightly, but never taking his eyes off the unexpected visitor. "I want you to know," Richard began, breaking the uncomfortable silence, "that what I'm offering is not a mere donation or charity. I don't want you to feel that I'm trying to buy your gratitude. This is not about me. It's about you, about Emily, and her act of kindness." Rachel watched him with a furrowed brow, her hands tightly clasped on the table. Although his words sounded sincere, all of this was too much, too fast, and too improbable. Why would a man like him do all this? Something didn't add up. "Mr. Collins," she said slowly, choosing each word carefully, "I appreciate your kindness, but we don't need help. We've always managed on our own. I know our conditions aren't the best, but I don't want Emily to grow up thinking she can get things without effort." Richard looked at her with understanding and nodded. "I understand, I really do. But let me say something. Accepting help isn't a sign of weakness. Sometimes even the strongest need a helping hand. Your daughter didn't give me that sandwich expecting anything in return. It was a pure, selfless act. And that's why I feel compelled to do something in return. I'm not trying to force you, but please, at least allow me to offer you some options." Rachel bit her lower lip thoughtfully. She glanced at Emily, who was still clinging to her arm. Her daughter had gone through so much. Losing her father, her grandfather's illness, the constant struggle to survive. Didn't she deserve a break, an opportunity for a better future? "What kind of options?" she finally asked. Richard smiled, as if he had been waiting for that question. "First, I would like to help your father with his treatment. I know several specialists who could provide him with the care he needs. I could help make his life more comfortable and, perhaps, just perhaps, give him a few more good years." Rachel's face hardened. She knew how important Henry was to Emily, but that offer made her feel as if she were selling something intangible, something that couldn't be measured. "I can't promise he'll accept," she began to say, but Richard interrupted her gently. "I'm not asking you to accept anything without considering it. I just want to give you the opportunity to choose." Then he turned his gaze to Emily. "And for you, Emily, I want to make sure you can attend the best school in the city. I want you to have every opportunity you deserve to shine and achieve your dreams." Emily's eyes widened in surprise. Go to a new school? The idea was both exciting and terrifying. She loved her small school despite its difficulties, but she had always dreamed of being somewhere with more resources, where the books weren't torn and the classes weren't interrupted by leaks in the roof. "A new school?" she whispered, almost in disbelief. Richard nodded. "Yes, and I'd also like to make some improvements to your home. I know it's humble, but you deserve to live with dignity. I don't want to change who you are. I just want to ensure that you're comfortable and safe." The silence in the room was overwhelming. Rachel looked at Richard, then at Emily, and finally at her father, who was still watching from the doorway with bright eyes. She could see the hope in their faces, the longing for something better. But accepting that offer meant giving in. It meant admitting that they couldn't do everything alone. "I don't know what to say," she murmured, her voice breaking slightly. Richard leaned forward, resting his hands gently on the table. "Don't say anything yet. Just think about it. I don't want to pressure you. If you decide to turn it all down, I'll understand and won't insist. But if you accept, I'll be here to support you in whatever you need." Rachel took a deep breath, looking at Richard as if trying to see into his soul. There was sincerity in his eyes, but there was also something else, a kind of hidden pain. What really motivated him? What was behind this man who had gone from being a beggar to a millionaire in less than a day? Finally, she nodded slowly. "All right, I'll think about it. But I need time to talk to my family." Richard stood up slowly, respecting her decision. "Take all the time you need. I'll be nearby." He took a card out of his pocket and placed it on the table. "If you decide to accept, call me, and if not, I'd still love to hear from you." With a final smile toward Emily, he said goodbye and left the house. The door closed with a soft click, leaving Rachel, Emily, and Henry in a dense silence filled with mixed emotions. "Mom," Emily murmured, her voice barely audibly. "Are we going to accept?" Rachel looked at her daughter, seeing the hope and doubt in her eyes. Then she turned to her father, who nodded slightly, with a mixture of sadness and acceptance. "I don't know, Emily. I don't know. But whatever happens, we'll make the decision together, because we're a family, and that's what matters most." And so, as the evening shadows grew longer, Rachel felt the weight of the world settle on her shoulders, faced with a choice that could change their lives forever. The phone in the small Parker house wouldn't stop ringing. Rachel glanced at it nervously each time it rang, her trembling hands barely able to hold the cup of tea in front of her. In just a few hours, her world had been turned upside down. What should have been a moment of quiet reflection to decide what to do about Richard's offer had turned into a media frenzy that seemed impossible to escape. It all began that morning when the usual bustle of the neighborhood was interrupted by the sound of approaching vehicles. They weren't just any cars, they were press vans loaded with recording equipment and cameras, and in the blink of an eye, dozens of reporters had gathered outside the house, speaking loudly and pointing microphones at the windows. Rachel watched in horror from inside, holding Emily tightly, as if that simple gesture could protect her from all the chaos erupting outside. "Mrs. Parker, is it true that a millionaire wants to adopt your daughter?" shouted a reporter, holding up a microphone. "Emily, how do you feel knowing that your life will change forever?" exclaimed another, pointing his camera at the little girl. "Tell us, ma'am, did you plan this from the beginning?" demanded someone else, their tone laden with suspicion. Rachel clenched her jaw and stepped back, pulling Emily out of reach of the flashes creeping through the window. The little girl was terrified, her eyes wide, unable to understand how a small act of kindness could have triggered such a storm. Her mother, still holding her tightly, made a decision. "Let's go to Grandpa's room," she whispered. "Stay with him, honey. I'll handle this." The house shook under the weight of voices and questions. Rachel took a deep breath and walked toward the door, head held high and heart pounding. When she opened it, the light of the flashes blinded her momentarily. She shielded her eyes and looked at the crowd of reporters with expectant expressions. For a moment, she felt small, insignificant in front of that sea of faces staring at her with a mix of interest and suspicion. "Please, leave my family alone," she said firmly, despite the tremor inside her. "I have nothing to say." But her simple appearance only fueled the flames. The reporters jostled each other, raising their cameras higher, struggling to capture every word and every gesture. The questions tripped over each other, each one more cutting than the last. "How does it feel to be the mother of the modern Cinderella?" "Why won't you accept Mr. Collins's offer? Is it true that you're considering it?" "The neighbors say you might be playing him for more money." The words stabbed at her heart like knives. Rachel pressed her lips together and shook her head, knowing that every gesture, every response would be interpreted in 1,000 different ways. "This isn't what you think," she began to say, but stopped herself. There was no way to explain what was happening without making things worse. "Please, just leave us alone. This is all a misunderstanding." The murmurs grew louder. The reporters, insatiable, swarmed like an angry hive of bees. Some even began throwing veiled accusations at her. "A misunderstanding?" a woman exclaimed, her smile not reaching her eyes. "But wasn't it your daughter who won the millionaire's heart? Are you saying you don't want to accept a fortune that could change your life forever?" Rachel felt her face flush, the heat rising from her neck to her cheeks. But before she could respond, a black car appeared around the corner. It came to a screeching halt in front of the crowd, and Richard Collins stepped out, his face tense and his gaze resolute. "Enough," he said loudly, his tone as sharp as a whip. The reporters fell silent instantly. Some stepped back, surprised by his presence, while others adjusted their cameras eagerly, knowing the arrival of the millionaire was a golden opportunity for their story. Richard strode quickly toward Rachel and positioned himself in front of her, like a shield, his dark eyes shooting daggers at the journalists. "This is unacceptable," he growled. "This family is not at fault for anything. You're invading their privacy and twisting what's really happening." "Mr. Collins," shouted a reporter, seizing the pause, "is it true that you offered your fortune to this girl? Are you planning to adopt her?" "Is it true that Rachel Parker manipulated her daughter to tug at your heartstrings?" asked another, with a malicious smile. Richard clenched his fists, struggling to keep his composure. The world seemed to spin in slow motion around him. He never imagined that a simple gesture of gratitude could trigger such chaos. But the worst part was knowing that Rachel and Emily were paying the price for his impulsiveness. "None of that is true," he said with controlled calm, though fury simmered beneath the surface. "What happened was an act of pure generosity from Emily. No one manipulated me. No one planned this. She was simply kind. And I'm here to protect her and make sure they don't suffer anymore because of this." The cameras clicked frantically, capturing every nuance of his expression. Some reporters still didn't relent. "Are you going to help them financially then?" one of them insisted. "I will help them in the way they choose," Richard replied firmly. "But it's not your decision, nor mine. It's up to this family." Then, with a final warning glance at the crowd, he turned to Rachel and gave a slight nod. "Please, go inside," he said softly. "I'll take care of this." Rachel, still trembling, took a step back. She wanted to thank him, but the words caught in her throat. With a small nod, she closed the door, leaving Richard to face the swarm of reporters alone. Inside, The house was shrouded in shadows. Emily watched from the hallway, her eyes wide and full of fear. Rachel knelt down in front of her and wrapped her arms around her, feeling the tremor in her daughter's small body. "I'm sorry, honey," she whispered, tears in her eyes. "I didn't want this to happen to you." Emily shook her head, clinging to her mother. "It's not your fault, Mom. I just wanted to help. Why is everyone so angry?" Rachel didn't know how to respond. How could she explain to her daughter that in a world full of greed and distrust, a simple act of kindness could be twisted and destroyed by the desire for sensationalism? "The world is complicated, Emily," she said finally, "but you did the right thing, and that's what matters. No matter what happens, never stop being like that, okay? Never stop doing the right thing." Emily nodded slowly, but her eyes reflected the same confusion and sadness Rachel felt deep in her soul. The commotion outside continued, and Rachel knew with a heavy heart that things wouldn't calm down so easily. Richard was there to help, but even his presence only seemed to worsen the situation. The next few days were a whirlwind of interviews, newspaper articles, and TV reports. The neighbors, who had barely spoken to her before, now tried to approach with forced smiles and empty compliments, hoping to benefit from the attention the Parker family was receiving. Rachel stayed locked inside the house with her family, unsure of how to stop the storm. Meanwhile, the voices grew louder and louder, more and more critical. Rachel Parker, the mother who refuses a millionaire's help. Pride or strategy? Is she using her daughter to gain fame? The dark side of kindness. Each headline, each insinuation was a stab to her heart, and as the neighborhood buzzed with gossip and the pressure mounted, Rachel felt the ground crumbling beneath her feet. Because now, it wasn't just about an offer of help. It was about her reputation, Emily's innocence, and their dignity. And the war had only just begun. Things took a sudden turn for the worse when Daniel Collins arrived in the neighborhood. Everything seemed a bit darker and heavier the day the sleek black car parked at the corner of the street, its tinted windows concealing the imposing figure of a young man who stepped out with an air of authority. Dressed in an expensive suit, his hair slicked back, and a cold gaze that seemed to pierce through anyone in his way, Daniel radiated a presence so intimidating that even the nosiest neighbors took a few steps back at the sight of him. Rachel watched from the window, frowning. She didn't know him, but something about the way he walked toward her house sent a chill down her spine. Emily, standing beside her, instinctively took her mother's hand, squeezing it tightly. "Who is he, Mom?" she asked in a trembling voice. Rachel didn't answer immediately. She just squeezed her daughter's hand, feeling a sense of danger she hadn't felt with Richard. This man wasn't here in peace. Daniel stopped in front of the door and knocked softly, a courtesy that contrasted sharply with the disdain in his expression when Rachel cautiously opened the door. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Parker," he said in a soft voice, but with a condescending tone that made her tense. "I'm Daniel Collins, Richard Collins' son. I'm afraid we need to discuss some family matters." "We have nothing to talk about," Rachel replied firmly, trying to close the door, but Daniel placed a hand on the frame, stopping it with surprising ease. "I think we do, Ma'am. For some strange reason, my father has decided to get involved in your lives, and I want to understand why." Rachel looked at him in disbelief. There was something in his dark eyes, something cold and calculating, that made her take a step back. But she refused to show fear, not in front of this stranger who thought he had the right to intrude on her house and her life. "Your father made us an offer, that's all," she said, lifting her chin. "But we don't owe you anything." Daniel smiled, a gesture that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, of course. You don't owe me anything. But do you know what worries me?" He leaned slightly forward, lowering his voice. "That you might be trying to take advantage of him. I've seen cases like this before, Mrs. Parker. Poor families groveling to get a piece of someone like my father's wealth. And I'm not going to let that happen here." Rachel felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. What was this man insinuating? How dare he speak to her like this in her own home? "That's not true," Emily exclaimed, stepping forward with her face flushed. "Mum hasn't done anything wrong." Daniel looked down at the girl, and for a moment something like surprise crossed his face, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "And you must be Emily," he said with a fake smile. "The little heroine, right? The girl who touched the great Richard Collins's heart." He straightened and turned his gaze back to Rachel. "Listen closely, Mrs. Parker. I don't care what you've done or how you did it, but if I find out that you're manipulating my father or have some hidden agenda," his tone sharpened like a knife, "I'll make sure you regret it. My father may be soft and generous, but I'm not." The silence that followed was overwhelming. Rachel felt her heart pounding in her ears, but she forced herself to stay firm. She wouldn't allow this man to intimidate her in her own home. "We don't want anything from you or your father, if that's how you feel," she said with a steady voice, though her legs trembled. "If you think you can scare us, you're very wrong." Daniel let out a short laugh, a sound devoid of humor. "We'll see." He turned sharply, as if he'd lost interest. "But I warn you, I'll be watching closely. And believe me, I'm not as easy to fool as my father." With those words, he walked away, leaving Rachel and Emily standing at the door, stunned and shaking from the intensity of the encounter. "Mum," Emily whispered, her eyes brimming with tears. "Why did he say that? Why does he hate us?" Rachel hugged her tightly, not knowing what to say. All she could do was hold her daughter and murmur over and over that everything would be fine, even as fear coiled in her stomach like a snake. Because now, everything had changed. Daniel Collins wasn't just an obstacle, he was a real threat, and she knew he would do anything to destroy them if he set his mind to it. The days that followed Daniel's visit were tense and filled with uncertainty. The neighborhood had become a hotbed of rumors and malicious comments. The neighbors, who used to approach with forced smiles and curiosity, now looked at them with disdain and suspicion. Rachel felt it every time she went out to buy groceries or when Emily walked to school. Whispers, furtive glances, gestures of contempt. And everything exploded one morning when Rachel received an unexpected call from one of the neighbors. "Have you seen what they're saying about you in the news?" the voice asked nervously. Before she could respond, her phone lit up with notifications. A flood of messages where distant relatives and acquaintances from the past tagged her on social media with comments full of shock and criticism. Her name and Emily's were on everyone's lips, for all the wrong reasons. Rachel, her hands trembling, opened the link she had been sent. Her heart stopped when she saw the headline. "Rachel Parker, the manipulative mother behind the great scam. Evidence of her plan to con Richard Collins." The words blurred before her eyes as she read the lines filled with venom. Leaked documents show that Rachel Parker contacted Richard Collins long before their supposed chance encounter. Text messages and conversations suggest that the Parker family planned to manipulate the businessman by posing as needy victims. Is Emily really the sweet girl who moved everyone, or just a pawn in her mother's dirty game? "What?" she whispered, unable to process what she was seeing. Her hands shook as she scrolled down, horror mounting as she saw the so-called evidence presented. Falsified emails, manipulated text conversations, and even a supposed letter written by Rachel to Richard, begging for financial help before the incident in the park. Every line was a blatant lie, an attempt to poison her family's image. "No, this can't be happening," she murmured, feeling her world crumble around her. Rachel's eyes darted through the article, seeing phrases that accused her of setting up the entire scenario, of using Emily as a bait to reel in Richard's sympathy. They had fabricated an entire narrative around her, twisting every detail of her life to fit the story of a cunning woman orchestrating a grand deception. Tears blurred her vision as she read the vicious comments flooding the page. Strangers who had never met her were tearing her apart with words sharper than any blade. What a horrible mother. She should be ashamed, using her own daughter like that. She doesn't deserve a single cent from that man. Her chest tightened, and she could barely breathe. Everything she had worked for, every ounce of dignity she had tried to maintain for Emily's sake, was being shattered by lies. "No, no, this can't be true," she whispered again, as if saying it aloud could erase the nightmare unfolding before her eyes. But deep down, she knew that once a lie like this took hold, it was almost impossible to uproot. She was no longer just a mother trying to protect her child. She was now a target, and the people who had created this monstrous story were intent on destroying her. Because someone powerful and relentless, wanted to make sure that no one would ever believe in her or Emily again. And Rachel had a terrible suspicion about who was behind it all. Daniel Collins. The thought hit her like a punch to the gut. He had warned her, threatened her, and now, this smear campaign was his way of making good on his promise. Tears streamed down her face as she thought of her daughter. How would she protect her from this? How could she keep Emily safe in a world that was ready to tear them apart based on lies? She had no idea, but one thing was clear: she couldn't let him win. For Emily's sake, she had to fight back, no matter how impossible it seemed. Because if she didn't, they would lose everything. But things didn't stop there. Just minutes later, several reporters were back outside her house, cameras ready, and questions as sharp as knives. "Mrs. Parker, is it true that you planned this from the beginning?" a voice shouted. "Tell us the truth. Did you use your daughter to get money?" another one exclaimed, shoving his microphone toward the door. Rachel froze, unable to move or even breathe. But then, the door burst open, and Richard Collins appeared beside her, his face hardened with fury. "This is a complete lie!" he shouted, stunning everyone present. "There is no scam here. These evidences are cheap fabrications." The reporters fell silent for a second before chaos erupted again. "Then what can you say about this, Mr. Collins? Why would you defend someone like this?" Richard raised his hands, demanding silence. "These accusations are absurd," he roared. "Rachel and Emily have done nothing wrong. I was the one who approached them after Emily offered me her sandwich. There was no scheme, no manipulation. Everything you're seeing is the work of someone trying to destroy this family." The cameras flashed, capturing every moment of the tension. But the seed of doubt had already been planted, and the damage was done. It didn't matter how vehemently Richard defended them. The headlines, the news, and the opinions had already been poisoned. People had found something to feed their morbid curiosity, and they wouldn't let it go so easily. That night, when the commotion finally died down, Rachel collapsed in the living room of her house, her head in her hands and her heart shattered. Emily watched her from the corner, her small frame hunched over as if she were about to disappear. "Mom," she whispered, "why are they doing this to us?" Rachel had no answer. She could only hold her daughter tightly in her arms, feeling the rage, sadness, and helplessness swirl into a storm within her. Meanwhile, a few streets away, Daniel Collins watched the news on a small screen in his car. A slight, satisfied nod crossed his face as he saw the pain reflected in Rachel's expression. He had hired the best experts in information manipulation, and every penny spent had been worth it. "This is just the beginning, Mrs. Parker," he murmured to himself, a cold smile spreading across his lips. "If you want to go up against me, you'll see what it really means to play with fire." And then he turned off the screen, letting the silence of the night swallow his satisfaction. Because now, the war wasn't just about protecting his father, it was personal. Rachel was on the brink of despair. The past few days had been a whirlwind of attacks, rumors, and malicious comments. Every time she looked at the news or social media, she found her name dragged through the mud and Emily's image trampled. But the worst part was seeing her little girl become sadder, quieter, almost withdrawn. The light that used to shine in her eyes was dimming, and Rachel felt utterly powerless to protect her. The reporters didn't leave the front of her house, and the few neighbors who used to support her had turned cold and distant. "That woman manipulated a millionaire," they whispered behind her back. "What a disgrace. Poor Emily. She must be just like her mother." Despair hung over her like a dark cloud, threatening to crush her. But just when everything seemed lost, Richard appeared at her door again, his expression reflecting a mix of determination and something he had never shown before, a kind of silent pain. "We need to talk," he said bluntly when Rachel opened the door. She looked at him incredulously. She was exhausted, emotionally drained, and every time she saw Richard, all she felt was how guilt and shame twisted inside her. "What more is there to say?" she asked in a hollow voice. "All of this. It's a complete mess." Richard nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the ground. "I know, and I feel responsible. All of this started because I wanted to prove something to the world, but I never imagined my own son would do this." "Daniel!" Rachel looked at him in surprise. "Are you saying that—" Richard raised his eyes, and the intensity in them almost made her take a step back. "He's the one behind everything. The falsified evidence, the rumors, the sensationalist news. It was Daniel who orchestrated this attack against you, and against me." He paused, as if the words were difficult to say. "But I'm going to stop him." Rachel felt a knot form in her throat. The mix of anger and relief left her stunned, unable to decide if she should thank Richard or scream at him for bringing such chaos into their lives. "And what are you going to do?" she whispered. Richard took a deep breath, and with a gesture that seemed almost painful, he pulled a small recording device out of his pocket. "I need you to listen. This is what I recorded during my last conversation with Daniel when he threatened to destroy you if I didn't step away from your family. I want people to know the truth, and for that, I need your permission to make it public." Rachel stared at the device with a frown. The idea of exposing more of her life terrified her, but then she thought of Emily. She thought of her daughter, who no longer wanted to go out and play, who had stopped smiling and knew she had no other options left. "Do what you have to do," she murmured finally, "but if this backfires on us—" "It won't happen," said a new voice from the doorway. Rachel and Richard turned, surprised. Leonardo Harding, Richard's personal lawyer, was standing at the entrance. He was an older man, with grey hair and a stern look, but there was something in his expression that radiated confidence and assurance. "I'm going to handle everything," Leonardo said firmly. "I've gathered evidence that refutes all of Daniel's accusations. He bribed journalists, paid off neighbors, and forged legal documents. We're going to expose him. But we need you to trust us, Mrs. Parker." Rachel watched the two men in silence, trying to gauge their intentions. They had brought chaos into her life, but they had also brought the truth. And if that truth could restore peace and dignity for her daughter, she was willing to take the risk. "All right," she whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. "Do what you have to do." Leonardo nodded respectfully and turned to Richard. "I'll make it official tomorrow morning, but you need to be ready. Daniel won't sit back and let this happen." Richard pressed his lips together, nodding slowly. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect them," he said, looking at Rachel with a mix of regret and determination. "I won't let this chaos destroy your family, Rachel. I promise." The next day, the news and social media erupted with a new wave of headlines, but this time they were very different. Exposed, the true villain behind the Collins scandal. Daniel Collins, son of the tycoon, accused of sabotage and media fraud. Evidence revealed. Recordings reveal the dark manipulation of Daniel Collins. Did he sabotage his own father? The media pounced like a swarm of wasps on Daniel, devouring every detail of his betrayal. The recording where he threatened Richard was clear and damning. His cold, calculating words echoed with a harshness that chilled the audience. "If you want to keep playing the savior, go ahead, father. But I will destroy that woman and her daughter, and when it's all over, they will hate you, just like I do." With the truth out in the open, the narrative shifted completely. Rachel and Emily were no longer seen as manipulators, they were victims of a twisted conspiracy. The neighbors, who once despised them, started approaching with apologies and forced smiles, trying to erase their previous behavior. But Rachel had no interest in their empty words, because for her, the only opinion that mattered was her daughter's. "Is everything going to be okay now, Mom?" Emily asked, her eyes bright with hope. Rachel hugged her tightly, feeling an overwhelming sense of relief. "Yes, sweetheart, everything's going to be okay," she whispered. "The worst is over." And as the lights of the cameras and the gaze of the reporters turned toward Daniel, Rachel knew that, at least for now, they had won a small battle. But the war wasn't over yet. Daniel wasn't someone who would give up easily, and she would stay alert in case he decided to strike again. The news of Daniel Collins's scandal spread like wildfire. Within hours, the media went from portraying Rachel and Emily as the manipulators of the millionaire to presenting Daniel as the true villain of the story. The recording of his threat circulated everywhere, on television, social media, and even became a topic of debate on talk shows. Daniel's words, filled with hatred and contempt, echoed in every corner. "I will destroy that woman and her daughter. When I'm done, everyone will see who really has the power." Those phrases became symbols of cruelty and abuse of power, and people began to demand justice. Daniel was forced to resign from his position at Collins Enterprises and faced a storm of lawsuits and investigations from former employees and legal associations. The damage to his reputation was so severe that even those closest to him distanced themselves. But for Richard, the victory tasted bitter. Although he had protected Rachel and Emily, he did so at an immense personal cost. He had to publicly destroy his own son, and the bitterness of that sacrifice consumed him. "Is everything all right?" Rachel asked one afternoon when Richard appeared at her door, looking more exhausted than ever. It had been days since Daniel was exposed, and although the pressure from the media on Rachel and Emily had eased, Richard had yet to recover fully. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his shoulders were hunched, as if carrying the weight of the world. Yes. Well, no. Richard let out a small, sad laugh, devoid of humor. "I don't know if everything will ever be all right again, Rachel. But I did it. I managed to protect you both. That's the only thing that comforts me." Rachel nodded, feeling a pang of sympathy. She had hated Daniel for what he did to them, but seeing the pain in Richard's eyes reminded her that, despite everything, he was still his son. "What's going to happen to him?" she asked quietly. Richard remained silent for a moment, staring at the empty street in front of the house, as if searching for answers in the cracked asphalt. "I don't know. Legally, he'll face charges, but that's not what worries me the most." He sighed, lowering his head. "What hurts the most is knowing that my son became a man filled with hatred and resentment, and I did nothing to stop it." Rachel felt a knot form in her stomach. She didn't know what to say. She couldn't imagine the pain of having to choose between justice and one's own flesh and blood. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Richard turned to her, his eyes full of sadness and gratitude. "You don't have to apologize for anything." He managed a weak smile. "I just wanted, well, I wanted to say I'm sorry, if it weren't for me. None of this." He gestured around them, encompassing the house, the neighborhood, their lives. "None of it would have happened." "But it wasn't your fault," Rachel interrupted gently. "All of this was Daniel's doing. You tried to do something good, even though things didn't turn out as you hoped." Richard nodded slowly, but his expression remained burdened with guilt. "I wish I could make it up to you somehow, not just with money or help. I want to make sure you have peace, that you can move on with your lives without me being a shadow in the background, reminding you of everything that happened." Rachel looked at him, considering his words. It had been a long and painful journey, but she knew Richard had never intended to hurt them. He had been reckless, yes, but his intentions were always genuine. "You don't need to disappear," she finally said. "What we need now is to move forward." She paused, searching for the right words. "And if that means accepting you as someone who cares about us, then we'll accept it." Richard looked up, surprised. "Really?" Rachel smiled slightly. "Yes, but no more extravagant gifts," she added firmly. "If you really want to help us, then help us get our lives back, little by little." Richard nodded, visibly relieved. "Thank you, Rachel. Truly thank you." That afternoon, for the first time since everything began, he felt a glimmer of hope. But there was still one more important conversation left. Later that day, as the sun began to set, Richard went to the place where it had all started, his son's luxurious apartment. Daniel was waiting for him on the balcony, wearing the same defiant expression as always, though his eyes reflected a deep pain. "Are you here to tell me you were right?" Daniel asked mockingly as Richard approached. Richard shook his head. "No, Daniel, I'm here to say goodbye." His son frowned at him. "What do you mean?" Richard took a deep breath, letting the cool night air calm him. "I want you to face the consequences of your actions, but I also want you to know that, despite everything, you're still my son. And although you've caused me a great deal of pain, I can't hate you." Daniel opened his mouth to argue, but Richard raised a hand, stopping him. "I'm going to step away for a while. I don't know for how long, but I need to heal, just like you do." He paused, studying his son's face. "But if you ever decide to change, if you ever want to redeem yourself, I'll always be here for you." Daniel's eyes darkened, and for a moment it seemed like he was going to shout at him to tell him to go to hell. But then something broke in his expression. He lowered his head, his shoulders tense, his breathing uneven. "Why?" he finally whispered, his voice cracking. "Why do you still care for me after everything?" Richard stepped closer, moved. "Because you're my son, and I'll never stop loving you." Daniel squeezed his eyes shut, fighting back tears. When he opened them again, the hatred was gone, replaced by a deep, heartbreaking sadness. "I don't deserve it." Maybe not. But forgiveness isn't given because someone deserves it. It's given because it's the right thing to do. Richard let his words sink in, then stepped back. With one last look at his son, he turned around and walked out of the apartment. He knew Daniel's path to redemption would be long, if he ever chose to walk it. But at least now, he had planted the seed. Because sometimes true change doesn't begin with punishment, but with a simple offer of forgiveness. The neighborhood slowly started to regain the peace it once had. After the truth about Daniel was revealed and the accusations collapsed, Rachel and Emily were finally able to breathe. The reporters disappeared, and the media's attention gradually faded. The focus shifted to new scandals and dramas, leaving the Parker family with a calm they hadn't felt in a long time. With Richard's support, but in a much subtler manner, Rachel began to rebuild her life. Richard had been firm in his promise to respect her wishes. No more grand gestures, no more drastic changes, just concrete help. Henry's oxygen generator, which was finally replaced with a new, quiet model, the repairs in the house, carried out discreetly and without publicity, and a small scholarship for Emily, allowing her to attend a better school, but without the pressure of being the center of attention. For Emily, things were still challenging at school. Although some classmates looked at her with envy, most had begun to accept that she was just an ordinary girl who had gone through an extraordinary situation. There were still whispers behind her back, but most just saw her as Emily, the kind girl who always smiled, despite everything. One day, as they walked home together after school, Emily looked at her mother with a thoughtful expression. "Mum, do you think one day all of this will be forgotten?" she asked softly. Rachel smiled, gently brushing her daughter's hair. "Maybe, sweetheart, but what's important isn't that it's forgotten, but that we learn from it. What happened to you? What happened to us? It's part of who we are now, but it doesn't define who we'll become." Emily nodded slowly, digesting her mother's words. Then she looked up, taking in the street that was once filled with cameras and people shouting her name. Now there was only the gentle murmur of neighbors and the singing of birds. Everything seemed so calm that it was hard to believe that peace had ever been shattered. "And do you think Mr. Collins will be okay?" she asked cautiously. "I haven't seen him around." Rachel sighed, thinking of Richard. After Daniel's public downfall, he had decided to step away for a while. He had explained that he needed space to heal and to rediscover who he was without the shadow of his son. But before leaving, he had visited Rachel one last time. "He'll be all right, Emily. He's a good man, and I think he found something here that he had lost a long time ago," Rachel replied with a calm smile. Emily frowned thoughtfully. "Something he had lost?" "Yes, darling. Hope." Rachel gently squeezed her daughter's hand. "You gave that to him, with a simple act of kindness." Emily nodded slowly, as if finally grasping the magnitude of what she had done. Then a small smile appeared on her face. "So, do you think we'll see him again someday?" Rachel didn't respond immediately. She looked off into the distance, picturing the man who had gone from a stranger to an ally and then to a friend. She knew that Richard Collins was a restless soul, someone who wouldn't stay in one place for long, but he was also a man who kept his promises. "Yes, Emily, I think he'll come back. Maybe not tomorrow or next week, but one day, yes." The little girl smiled, satisfied with the answer, and they continued walking, enjoying the peacefulness of the afternoon. When they reached home, they found a small envelope at the door with a simple handwritten note, "Thank you for restoring my faith. With love, Richard." Inside the envelope, there was just a single photograph, an image of the tree in the park where everything had begun. Under the tree's shade, Emily was pictured handing a sandwich to a man covered in an old, tattered blanket. The snapshot had captured that intimate and pure moment when the kindness of a little girl changed the life of a broken man. Rachel felt a lump in her throat as she looked at the picture, and when she showed it to Emily, the girl smiled wistfully. "It was the best sandwich I've ever given," she murmured with a small laugh. Rachel chuckled softly, wiping away a tear that rolled down her cheek. "And the best he's ever received, I'm sure." They placed the photograph in a special spot in the living room, and when Henry saw it, he nodded approvingly. "In the end, a small act of kindness can change the world," he said softly, looking at his granddaughter with pride. Rachel knew at that moment that everything was finally falling back into place. The wounds would heal, time would pass, and they would move on, but they would always remember that photograph and what it represented. The proof that even the smallest gesture of kindness can create ripples that transform lives. And so, in that humble little house, Rachel and Emily began anew. Not with great fortunes or luxuries, but with something much more valuable, the certainty that no matter what happens, it's always possible to find light in the darkness, as long as there's love, hope, and the courage of a heart willing to do good. Several months had passed since their last contact with Richard Collins. Life in the neighborhood had returned to normal, with its everyday ups and downs and the tranquility of routines that both Emily and Rachel had learned to appreciate. The scandal had gradually faded away, like the echo of a distant storm, and the Parker family's name ceased to be a topic of conversation for the neighbors. Although they still occasionally encountered curious looks or uncomfortable questions, most of the time they were simply Rachel and Emily, the strong mother and the brave girl who had overcome a very difficult trial. But something in their daily lives had changed forever. They had learned to be stronger, closer, and to cherish every little moment of joy. The house, with its freshly painted walls and the new oxygen generator for Henry, felt more like a home than ever. One morning, as Emily was packing her backpack for school, she heard the unmistakable sound of a helicopter in the distance. At first, she thought she was imagining it. But when the engines grew louder, Rachel appeared at the kitchen door, wearing an expression of surprise. "Again?" she murmured, a mix of confusion and amusement. Emily ran to the window, her heart leaping as she saw the helicopter landing in the very spot where everything had started. She gasped when the door opened and a tall, familiar figure stepped out with a warm smile. "Richard!" Emily shouted, dashing out the door before Rachel could stop her. The man, now without the sadness that had shadowed his eyes the last time, knelt down just as Emily reached him. She threw herself into his arms, laughing with joy as Richard enveloped her in a strong, almost fatherly embrace. "Little Emily," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I've missed seeing you." Rachel followed her daughter outside, a gentle smile on her face and a look of surprise shining in her eyes. "Richard," she said, watching him with a mix of disbelief and relief. "What are you doing here?" He stood up slowly, still keeping a hand on Emily's shoulder. "I've been traveling, searching for something I thought I'd left behind. But I finally realized that what I was looking for wasn't in any city or any company." He turned to Emily, looking at her tenderly. "It was here, in this little neighborhood, with two of the bravest people I've ever met." Emily looked at her mother, waiting for her reaction, but Rachel just smiled, crossing her arms. "Does that mean you're planning to stay?" Richard shook his head, though his expression remained calm. "Not exactly. I've learned that I can't change your lives the way I thought I could at first. But what I can do is be nearby, support you when you need it, and most importantly, be your friend, if you'll let me." The silence that followed was brief but full of understanding. Rachel glanced at her daughter, and Emily nodded eagerly. "Of course you can be our friend," the girl exclaimed, squeezing Richard's hand tightly. Richard laughed softly and looked at Rachel with a sincere smile. "What about you?" Rachel sighed, though her eyes were warm. "All right, Richard." She paused, thinking of everything they had been through. "We don't need more gifts or promises. We just need someone who truly cares. If you can give us that, you'll always be welcome here." Richard nodded, visibly relieved. "That's all I want to offer, and if you'll allow me..." He pulled something out of his jacket pocket, a small box wrapped with a blue ribbon. "I have one last gift. I promise it's not extravagant." Emily looked at him with curiosity, and Rachel narrowed her eyes, though Richard's expression was so honest that she couldn't help but nod. "All right, what is it?" Richard knelt in front of Emily and handed her the box with a smile. "This is something special, Emily, something that symbolizes what you taught me. I opened it many times while I was away, and each time it reminded me how lucky I was to have met you." Emily took the box with trembling hands and carefully untied the ribbon. When she lifted the lid, her eyes filled with tears. Inside was a small replica of a sandwich made of fine porcelain and painted by hand. But it wasn't just that. Next to the sandwich was a note written in elegant handwriting. "Kindness is the most valuable act there is. Thank you for teaching me how to be human again." Emily looked up at Richard, tears streaming down her cheeks, but a bright smile on her face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. Richard hugged her again, feeling his own heart fill with warmth. "No, little one," he whispered. "Thank you." Rachel watched the scene with a deep sense of peace. The man who had brought chaos and confusion into their lives was now standing before them with the sincere intention of simply being part of their story, not the protagonist. And for the first time in a long while, she knew that everything was exactly where it was meant to be. The helicopter left without him that afternoon, and Richard stayed for dinner. There were no luxuries, no grand promises, just laughter, stories, and the comfort of being surrounded by people who accepted him for who he was. At the end of the day, as they said their goodbyes, Emily looked up at him with eyes full of hope. "Will you come back soon?" Richard smiled, gently brushing her hair. "Always, Emily. Now I have a new home to come back to." And so he left, walking with light steps, leaving Rachel and Emily standing at the door of their home under the starry sky of a peaceful night. But this time, there were no final goodbyes, no empty promises. Because this time, the family he had found amidst the chaos was there, waiting for him with open arms. And so, another story comes to an end. A story filled with emotions and lessons that remind us of the power of kindness and the importance of never losing hope. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave us a like and share it with someone who could use a reminder that even in the darkest moments, a small act of kindness can change everything. Subscribe for more stories that inspire and touch the heart, and hit the notification bell so you never miss one. Remember, we should never underestimate the impact our actions can have on the lives of others. We'll see you in the next video, and until then, keep spreading kindness, because you never know whose life you might transform. Thank you for being with us,